We'd like to turn to the book of John, chapter 4, and then again 1 John, chapter 2. John chapter 4, read verses 9 and 10. This is part of Christ's conversation with the Samaritan woman. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. And then 1 John 2, we'll read verse 3 again. And hereby we do know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. In verse 10 of John 4, if thou knewest. 1 John 2, 3, we know that we know him. So both of these verses speak of a knowledge that transforms. Again, in John 4, Jesus says to the Samaritan woman, If thou knewest, she didn't, but if thou knewest, thou wouldest have. That is, if you knew, it would have affected what you did. John writes, we do know that we know him if, stating a condition. So Jesus tells the Samaritan woman that if she knew, it would have had an impact upon what she did. He's telling her she would have done differently if you knew. John writes, the assurance that we know him will manifest itself in behavior, in obedience. So again, what is being described is a knowledge that has the power to transform one's life. To transform simply means to change. It changes us. The cause of the change is knowledge. In Daniel 11, verse 32, it is stated, the people that do know their God, God being the object of knowledge, the people that do know their God shall be. So it's a knowledge that causes a state of being, shall be strong. A knowledge that those who truly know will have a state of being that corresponds to that knowledge. Then he says, and do. The people that do know their God shall be strong and do. So it's a knowledge that impacts one's being. It is a knowledge that impacts one's activity in life. It is a knowledge that changes the individual. It is a knowledge that changes and impacts life. So it is a thorough change. Our subject is transforming knowledge. Transforming knowledge. So let's look at the knowledge that is spoken of in the text verses. In John chapter 4, if thou knewest, she was ignorant. She was ignorant of a truth. He says, if thou knewest the gift of God. So she's ignorant of the gift of God. She was also ignorant of His person. If thou knewest the gift of God and who? And who? That's Him. If you knew. If you only knew. In the text in 1 John 2, John speaks of the knowledge of a person. We know Him. A knowledge of a truth, a basic fact, and a knowledge of a person. It is a knowledge of spiritual and eternal matters. The knowledge spoken of in our text verses by Christ and John is a knowledge that goes beyond and is greater and more significant than mere information. We get knowledge through information. But this is something that goes beyond information. It's something beyond and greater and more significant than intellectual knowledge. The knowledge spoken of in our text verses by Christ and by John. Something that goes beyond and is greater than mere insight. And it is something beyond and greater than an awareness and a realization. It includes all of these things. But it goes beyond. What is being spoken of in our text verses does consist of information about Christ, and it no doubt consists of an awareness and a realization of Christ. But it's more. It's more than mere information. It's more than just an awareness and a realization of Christ. Those things are extremely important. We need information. And we need to be aware and we need to realize. But as valuable as those things are, they can leave an individual detached and indifferent toward Christ. You can have information about Christ, and you may believe the information, but it leaves you indifferent. You may have an awareness. Well, I believe there's Christ. Well, that's good. That's an awareness. But that awareness can leave you detached and indifferent toward Christ. But what is spoken of in our text verses will not leave you detached and indifferent and unaffected. A lot of people know things about Christ. Doesn't affect their life. Doesn't affect their life. But again, the knowledge spoken of our text verses, it has a transformational impact upon our being, who we are. And it has a transformational impact upon our life. It's something that goes beyond theory and doctrine. It's very important that our doctrine concerning Christ be accurate. That's extremely important. But this goes beyond knowing doctrine. The knowledge of that Christ and John are speaking of in our text verses is not a natural knowledge. It is a supernatural knowledge, which means, by that we simply mean it's the work of God. It's not something we can produce. When Christ said, "If thou knewest the gift of God and who it is," if thou knewest, He's speaking of a knowledge that involves personal activity. If thou knewest, thou wouldest have. Thou wouldest have. But it's not merely activity. It is activity related to Him. Notice, thou wouldest have asked of Him. Of Him. He could have just said, thou wouldest have asked. But He said, thou wouldest ask of Him. Of Him. So it's an activity, but it's an activity that relates to Him. 1 John 2 verse 3. Linked to knowing Him is an activity. Keep. Keep. If you know that you know Him, you will keep. And this activity is related to Him. His commandments. So our text verses speak of a knowledge that is linked to and results in activity relating to Him. If thou knewest, thou wouldest asked of Him. So it is a knowledge that leads to Christ. If we truly know, we will move toward Christ, not away. It's an activity related to Him. A knowledge that keeps us moving in the direction of Christ. It's usually sad when someone says the words, if I only knew, I would have. And usually there's a sad story that follows. There's a lot of truth to that. If I only knew, I would have. There are a lot of things we would have done differently if we knew. And I'm not talking spiritually now, I'm just talking generally. A lot of things we would have done differently if we knew. But we didn't. Didn't affect our behavior. This is a knowledge that affects who we are. And it is a knowledge that affects what we do. Notice also in John 4 verse 10, if thou knewest, thou would have. So it affects activity. Asked Him. So it's an activity relating to Him. But notice also, it is a knowledge of blessing. And He would have given thee. If you knew, you would have received from Him. Again, it is a knowledge that has a transformational impact upon being and life. This is beyond and greater and more significant than knowing about Christ, than having an intellectual awareness and understanding. This is beyond that. We read in Psalm 9 verse 10, they that do know thy name, that's who He is, will put, that's an activity. They that know will. You can be certain of it. If they truly know, they will put their, that's personal, trust, that's confidence, in Thee. Again, you see an activity relating to Him. It is a knowledge that leads to a life that relates to Him. It does not move away from Him. Psalm 89:15, we read, blessed is the people that know the joyful sound. They shall walk. That's an activity. O Lord, in the light of thy countenance. Now that's activity relating to Him. That's what this knowledge does. It gives us a life that relates to Him. Not a life that tries to fit Him in every now and then. This is a life about Him. It's founded in this knowledge. It is a knowledge that results in confidence in Him, assurance in Him, persuasion and conviction in Him. Now we hear God say in Hosea chapter 4, in verse 6, He says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. He's not talking about intellectual knowledge. My people are destroyed because they do not know, for lack of knowledge. I believe that's still so today. The knowledge spoken of is the same as in our text verses. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. So you see, the knowledge spoken of in our text verses is a deterrent. It is a deterrent from ruin. Knowledge will spare your life in many ways. You know that if that car hits you, you're going to die or wish you were dead. Knowledge keeps you from just standing in the middle of the road. It affects your behavior. It affects what you do. And so it is when it comes to spiritual matters. People say, well, they know better. Do they? Do they really? Well, they've heard. Okay, now that's something different. They've heard. Yes, they have. That doesn't mean they know. Well, they know better, but. Well, Christ says, if thou knewest, thou wouldest have. I disagree. They don't know. They don't know. If they do, they're not too bright. Would be like Dave saying, oh, I know if I touch that open wire and I'm standing in this water, I'm going to have a problem. But you know what? I'm going to do it anyway. That wouldn't be too bright. It wouldn't be too bright. If thou knewest, thou would have, or you wouldn't have. So it's a deterrent. And how many people, God's people, who say they know, but they act contrary to what they say they know, and they ruin their lives. We need to know. Notice in John 8, verses 31 and 32. This knowledge is liberating. John 8, 31 and 32. Then said Jesus to those Jews which believed on Him. Now if you read the full chapter, you see they did not savingly believe. If ye continue in my word, then are ye my disciples indeed. And ye shall know the truth. And the truth you know, shall make you free. So this knowledge is liberating. I would contend that many a child of God would not be in the chains and prisons they are in if they knew. If they knew what they say, they know. This knowledge, notice in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, is a knowledge that will establish us. 2 Peter 1, verse 12. Wherefore, I will not be negligent to put you always in remembrance of these things, though you know them. You still need to be reminded, though you know them, and be established in the present truth. We do know that we know Him. And that gives us establishment. We're told throughout the New Testament that we're to be steadfast. That's what it means to be established. How do we do that? You've got to know Him. You've got to know Him. Know Him. Know Him and you will be steadfast. Know that you know. And you will be steadfast. The knowledge that both Christ and John are speaking of is a knowledge of personal experience, a knowledge of personal fellowship. And it is cyclic. The more that we know Him, the more we love Him. It's not like with some people, the more you know, the more you dislike them. No, the more you know Christ, the more you love Him. And the more you love Him, the more you obey Him. And the more you obey Him, it starts all over again. The more you know. And the more you love. And it just keeps going. So it's a good cycle to be in, to know Him. So let's make personal application. We hear Christ say to the Samaritan woman, if thou knewest. If thou knewest. Can you hear Christ whisper that many times in our own ears? If you knew. If you knew. If thou knewest, thou wouldest have. And John says we do know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. We need to know Him. We need to know Him in a way and on a level that impacts who we are. That impacts what we do. Most people today that want a religion that really has no impact upon them. I don't want it to change my life. We're talking about a knowledge that changes everything. It changes everything. And it's God that has to give that knowledge. We cannot attain unto it. It is one thing to know of Christ. It's something entirely different to know Him. It is one thing to know of the miracles performed by Him. It's another thing to know Him. And as wonderful and as encouraging as it is to be aware of His miracles, we need to know Him. And that's even more wondrous. And that's even more encouraging. As wonderful and encouraging as it is to know that He calmed the raging sea and He miraculously provided the needs of multitudes. That's wonderful to know. But it's even greater to know Him, the one who did those things. To know Him. To know Him by experience. A knowledge of Him that captures our thoughts and emotions. There are a lot of things I know that do not necessarily in my thoughts and does not affect me in my emotions and how I feel. But this is a knowledge that captures our thoughts. You can't get away from it. I know Him. And you find yourself thinking about Him. And it affects your feelings. It affects who you are. It affects what you do. It affects what you want to do. It's a transforming knowledge. Again, that causes us, I know Him and I want to talk to Him. I want to talk to Him. And I want to hear Him. I want to hear what He has to say. Because I know Him. And because I know that whatever He has to say is right. And I want to see Him. And I cherish Him. And I find myself cleaving to Him. Again, if thou knewest, thou would have. It's a knowledge that changes us. The Word of God tells us that Christ is a hiding place from the wind. He is a covert from the tempest. He's rivers of water in a dry land. He's a great rock in a weary land. Do we know? Do we know that by instruction and information? Or do we know it by personal experience? Big difference. Big difference. We need to know Him by way of experience. In Job 22:21, Eliphaz gave very good advice to Job. He said, acquaint now. Whatever the present is, acquaint thyself with Him. With Him. That's good advice. And we read in Hosea 6 verse 3, then shall we know if we follow on to know the Lord. And the more we know Him, the more we want to know Him. In Philippians chapter 3, Paul, speaking of what he was desiring and pursuing, says, verse 10, that I may know Him. That I may know Him. That should be our desire in all seasons of our lives. I need to know Him. I need to know Him more. And that's true. No matter what our knowledge of Him is, we need to know Him more. And we can. Whether it be times of joy, whether it be times of pleasure, successes, trials, or difficulties. Follow on to know Him. Whether it be a time of emptiness, or whether it be a time of peace, or whether it be a time of turmoil. Doesn't matter. Follow on to know Him. Why? Because of who He is. There's no one better you can know. And there's hope in Him. There's hope. We know Him. That gives hope. That gives hope. There's strength in that. I know Him. I may not know what's going to happen 2 seconds from now. And we don't. But I know Him. But I know Him. There's rest in that. There's a lot of things that can happen that you and I will not find rest in. But I know Him. There's rest there. If thou knewest, you'd be more restful. There's joy there. There's comfort. There's nothing discouraging about, I know Him. There's nothing you can find in that that's discouraging. It's comforting. It's fulfilling. It's encouraging. Follow on to know Him. There's certainty in knowing Him. There's certainty in that. Everything about us could be falling apart. But if we know Him, we know it's all well. It doesn't appear that way. But I know Him. There's peace in that. Oh, we need to set ourselves to know Him. We hear the psalmist, Psalm 39:4. Lord, make me to know Oh, we need to pray that often. Lord, cause me to know. Cause me to know You. The one who has said, Lord, I believe, help Thou my unbelief. We can say, Lord, I know, help my ignorance. Help my ignorance. Psalm 143, verse 8, cause me to know. Cause me to know. That is, make me to know. So it's the Lord that gives this knowledge. And that ought to be our constant plea. A greater, deeper knowledge of Him. A more firm grasp of Him. A more impactful and relevant knowledge of Him. There are things that we all know that don't really matter. It has no significance. And we all know some of those things. But this is a knowledge that matters. This is a knowledge that has significance. We can know. What an opportunity. I can know. And I can know more. We can have a greater level of what we do know. This is true concerning truth. This is true concerning His person. We need a knowledge, an impactful knowledge of Bible doctrine. Knowledge that impacts our life, impacts our thinking, impacts our view. We need a greater knowledge of the Word of God that causes us to have more interest in it. If we really know what this book is, you can't be indifferent toward it. If you really know what this book is, you'll have a desire and a hunger and a reverence for it. That we would reach a greater level and degree of what it means to be saved. If thou knewest. If thou knewest what it really means to be saved. Oh, the change. It would certainly cause us to be more thankful, more filled with praise, to reach a greater level and degree of knowing the truth of the Lord's church. There are a lot of people who know some church truth. Doesn't cause them to appreciate it. If thou knewest, you'd have a stronger desire for it. If we only knew, to reach a greater level and degree of knowing that He's coming again. It would cause us to be watchful. It would cause us to be expectant. We're not very watchful for the Lord's coming. Most of us, if not all of us, we don't give it a thought during the day. But if you knew, you would. If you knew, if you really knew that He's coming again, oh, you'd be looking. But we don't really know. We know it doctrinally, but it hasn't, for the most part anyway, looking around, it hasn't impacted people's lives. Hereby we do know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. We know by what it causes us to do. That's our level of knowledge. What does it cause me to do? What do I become? If thou knewest, thou wouldst have. Further on in the account, John 4, she did come to know both the gift of God and who it was that saith to thee. She came to know both. And what happened? It changed her. Because she left her water pot and went her way into the city and saith to the men, come see a man. Come see a man. Is not this the Christ? She came to know and changed her life. She came to know and her purpose that day changed. Her original purpose was to go to the well and draw water, but she left her water pot. It changed her purpose. Changed her focus. It changed her activity. Truth is, her whole life was changed because of what she came to know that day. Personal examination is necessary. What we know, to what degree does it impact our life? What you and I claim to know, what degree does it impact our life? Are we growing in our knowledge of Him? Can we say tomorrow, we know Him? And I know Him better tomorrow than I do today. That ought to be our life. We know Him. And I know Him more now than I did yesterday. That ought to be so. Again, the way to truly measure is in the terms of how impactful is it upon our lives. We know that we know by the transforming effect that it has upon our lives. So if you look at the lives of many who say they know, it doesn't show. Sure doesn't show. So what is it they know? We need to know Him. It'll change our lives. Brother Dave, if you'll come and lead us verse song.